Welcome back, everyone. I'm very excited about this last session, the Authors Roundtable of the John Rhoden Catalogue Symposium. Thank you all for being here. I get, again, the honor of introducing Dr. Brittany Webb, the Evelyn and Will Kaplan Curator of 20th Century Art in the John Rhoden Collection. In this role, Webb oversees PAFA's collections, exhibitions, and programs of the 20th century art. Brittany has led PAFA's museum team in our work to restore and preserve the John Rhoden Collection. I hope you've all had the chance to experience the transformative exhibition determined to be the Sculpture of John Rhoden, curated by Dr. Brittany Webb. I just want to say congratulations again and thank you, and I will hand it over to Brittany.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us for the Authors Roundtable. I have the honor and pleasure of introducing our panelists, your catalog essayists. I'll present us in order of appearance. Dr. Greg Barnhisel is the professor of English at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh and the author of James Laughlin, New Directions and the Remaking of Ezra Pound, published in 2005, and Cold War Modernists, Art, Literature, and American Cultural Diplomacy, published in 2015, and the editor of the scholarly journal Book History. His biography of the literary figure and spy, Norman Holmes Pearson, will be published by the University of Chicago Press in fall of 2024. Kelin Baldridge Smallwood is a processing archivist with the University of Pennsylvania's Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. She previously held various library and archives positions at the Chester County History Center, PAFA, the National Gallery of Art, and the Library of Congress. She holds a BA with a double major in art history and French and Francophone studies from the University of Pennsylvania and an MLIS from Drexel University. Dr. Catelyn Crawford lives and works in Birmingham, Alabama, where she is the William Cary Hulsey Curator of American Art at the Birmingham Museum of Art, where this exhibition will travel to next this October 2024. A native of Des Moines, Iowa, Kate earned her PhD from the University of Virginia and a BA from Columbia University. And last, but certainly not least, McCoy is the John Rhoden Curatorial Assistant here at PAFA, aiding in the production of this exhibition, the first major retrospective of mid-century African-American sculptor John Rhoden. They received their BA in art history from Temple University and is currently completing the master's thesis, round of applause please, in art history from Lindenwood University. And I thought what would be nice by having an author's roundtable is this is the part where the book comes to life a little bit. We get to hear from everybody who produced their work a bit about what their contributions to the catalog were and what the experience of doing this was like. So I'd love to start with you, Kelin.
Hello. Good. Can we advance the slide? Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure how to do that and I don't want to mess it up. So my name is Kelin Baldridge Smallwood. Like Brittany said, I'm an archivist at the University of Pennsylvania Special Collections Center and was previously the archivist for the John Rhoden papers here at PAFA, so I served under that NEH grant to process the John Rhoden papers. And I'll just start by giving some context to my essay and kind of explaining what my contribution to the catalog was about. I kind of started it by talking about what an archivist is. I think a lot of us know that word. People always ask me what on earth I actually do. So I talked a little bit about what we do, what our work is, and then talked about the specific nature of the John Rhoden papers and the work that they required, and then kind of finished the essay talking about some of the discoveries within the papers that the Rhoden archives team made throughout the work. And I do say team intentionally so that I can shout out the two wonderful archive team members who are PAFA's Director of Archives, Wang Tran, and the Rhoden Assistant Archivist, Jonna Auerbach. So I really couldn't take credit for this work without shouting them out. So first, what does an archivist do? The archivist is the person that takes primary source materials from wherever they come from and prepares them for research or use. So we kind of organize them, I guess first survey, where we see what they are, what their value is, and then think of a both intellectual and physical organization that is going to make the papers useful to researchers and self-contextualizing so that each, individual item makes sense within the greater context. And after we do that, we kind of describe the papers by either cataloging them or creating finding aids, is what we call kind of our access documents, that allow researchers to determine if a collection is going to be useful to them before they actually come in and make the commitment to use that collection. So the John Rhoden papers arrived at PAFA and they were a mess. I say, and that archivists deal with a lot of feces, we deal with a lot of dust, I should say mouse feces, specify there. And the Rhoden papers had all of that, they had been in a home for decades. And when they came to us, John had been deceased for nearly 20 years. So if there had been a system of organization that he gave to his papers, it was long gone. They were a mess, which as an archivist I really enjoyed. That meant I had a lot of work to do. I felt useful. So we did the kind of extensive work to actually organize it and describe it. And once that work was done, the Rhoden project actually had kind of a unique second component that involved digitizing virtually the entire collection. So we did 5,000 individual scans that represented 4,000 something objects. And all of these scans kind of represented the correspondence, the professional documents, which include a lot of contracts, stuff like that, printed material, which include exhibition catalogs, which were really useful, and photographic material, which was kind of my favorite part of the collection, the photographic material, which I have put in the slide, and we'll talk about more in a second. But all of this stuff is digitized, which really makes the Rhoden papers equitable. You don't have to be able to travel to PAFA to access it, which I think is really important and such a wonderful part of this project as a whole. So all of these kind of different formats I talk about, they come together to tell the story of Rhoden's life and his work. And that was such a beautiful thing to kind of watch and uncover as we kind of worked more and more, and working with Brittany, who helped contextualize that as we were in the middle of it, was incredible to be a part of. But back to the photographic material. We had incredible photographs, but for me the most interesting part were the color slides, 35mm color slides that represent Rhoden's pretty much his whole life, but most notably his travels in the 1950s and 1960s. And he traveled all over the world. I have him drinking out of a special wine pitcher in France up there. And so it's just this really visual, vivid way of seeing the world in the 1950s that I'm sure, not many people have had the opportunity to really see. But these photos came with very little information. He didn't put a lot of captions on things, so they weren't that useful for an information, in an informational sense. And so we made the decision, mostly based off of how fantastic they were, to really do a lot of research and figure out what these things were and how they could help, the story of Rhoden. And in the end, we were able to identify dozens of individuals and hundreds of locations. So they provided this just incredible insight into where he traveled, who he met, and what he was seeing and being inspired by during these formative years of travel in the 1950s, so kind of that early middle part of his career. So that's kind of just an overview of what my essay is, and I'm going to leave it there and leave the rest of the archives talk for the conversation. But I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Han, did you want to talk a bit about working on the chronology?
Sure. Firstly, I wanted to start by saying that it's really nice to be included on a panel of such renowned scholars. This has been a really great opportunity for me as an upcoming scholar, just learning about different research styles, and I've learned a lot from you, so I'm really grateful for the opportunity. So the chronology is basically just a timeline of John's life, and it was the first project that I worked on when I arrived at PAFA. Brittany asked if I was interested, and I was like, sure. And it was a really unique research experience for me because finishing up undergrad, I'm really used to traditional academia. There's already a lot of source material available. And so this was the first time that I was working with strictly archival material. So thank you, Kelin, for being a part of putting that together. It was great for me to familiarize myself with the collection and really start to get to know John as an artist as well as a person. Could you go to the next slide, please? So I found while I was digging and putting together really particular moments in John's life that the archives not only reveal his artistic practices, but really who John is as a person. I found him to be really engaging and just, so that's something that I really wanted to highlight. While I was working on the show, I had the opportunity to put together a couple of the slideshows, and they really represent John's personality, and I think that that was an important thing to include and something that I uncovered while I was putting together the timeline of his life. Next slide, please. And then I just wanted to briefly talk about my experiences. After putting together the timeline, I was able to travel to Rome for a little while on an unrelated work trip. It was an art history seminar, and we spent some time in Rome at the American Academy, and I was able to uncover some archival material that was relevant to the show and to the timeline of his life. And so that really helped solidify some of the directional flow and the narrative of the show. Brittany had already had an idea in her mind when I came on, but being able to access the archives at the American Academy really helped solidify the direction that we wanted to take things thematically. And that being said, I think John's time in Rome is my personal favorite era of his life. When he goes to Rome, he's a touch older than I am, but I was experiencing the same sort of wonder as a young person traveling to Italy, to Rome for the first time. I entered the American Academy and was imagining John's amazement as well on being there for the first time. And for a lot of people who enjoy art, going to Italy, Rome especially, is nothing short of enchanting. It was wonderful and magical for me, very transformative. So yeah, I think that was my I made it moment as like a researcher when I found the archival box full of information at the archives, and just being able to go through photos of the work that he made while he was a fellow at the American Academy. It was just really exciting, and I'm glad that I was able to experience that and sort of round out writing the chronology as sort of like a full circle moment for me and for John. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I am Brittany Webb, curator of this exhibition and co-convener of all of the things we are engaging today. And I'll talk a little bit about how important I think it was for the essay that I contributed to the catalog to just lay out a broad context. As somebody who is trained to think about deep context, it was really kind of challenging to be narrowed in this way. My colleague, Dr. Anna Marley, is in the room and constantly had to remind me, no, there is a very specific job that your essay as the curator has to do, and it cannot do that if you go down every rabbit hole that you want to in this essay. You cannot write an essay about the travel photography as its own body of work, as tempting as that was, because that work is so good. But one of the things that I hope it does is lay out a couple of really important contexts. And so we're looking at a slide of Rhoden in studio with Richmond Barté that comes from the archives of the Amistad Research Center. And I wanted to think about what that kind of mentorship produces for an artist pre-art school, that you have this kind of background that Rhoden had, where he was initially working in studio with an artist in Birmingham and then working in studio with an artist in New York, and that produces a particular kind of education before it's institutionalized, and we can read that a bit on his figurative work. I really appreciated knowing that Richmond Barthé had a kind of atelier-style art school training that is similar to PAFA's atelier-style art school training of the same era, and I felt like I could see that in the figurative work, and I hoped that viewers would understand that too, because it explains, I think, a split that happens later in his career as he moves away from this sort of emphasis on anatomy, and I love this Search for Truth sculpture. You're looking at photography by Sahar, and I think that one of the things that, if you get a chance to look closely at this sculpture, that I think comes out in the photography is that the anatomy is such a strong feature of it. I mean, you can really like count the muscle groups on this sculpture in a way that he moves away from, and it feels very early. But I do think that he was really a consummate artist. He was an artist everywhere he was, including this time that he spent serving in the military. And I think it's really interesting to think about an artist doing military service, and that service to the nation during World War II also being art making, that this kind of singular focus the entire time. The 4 years that he's serving in the Army is also art making. It's teaching art classes, it's doing murals on military bases, it's sculpting several busts of enlisted officers, thinking about what an artist is doing even while they're not technically in art. And there are all of these great archival letters where he talks about wanting to get back to the work of being an artist, but I was really reading that as, no, but he really was an artist the whole time. It's not really a departure or a break from an art making career when you have evidence that he was making this art the whole time. And then there's a really excellent essay in the catalog by Rebecca Van Diver, who could not join us today, but it discusses the importance of the press imprint that this artist had. I think that this is a moment in American history before we're thinking about the importance of press for an artist the way we think about this now. We really take for granted that press coverage is going to be amazing for an artist's career, but this image of Rhoden at the first art school, the first show for Columbia art students that Rhoden appears in, was printed in a 1949 article in the New York Times, and I think that it's really uncommon for an artist of this era to have this experience, especially someone like him. And so I really appreciate looking at this photo and thinking about Rhoden as somebody who post-World War II is finally in art school, you know, an arts institutionalized environment that he wants to be in after these mentorships, after being a military veteran, sort of smiling in the New York Times, the newspaper of record. This is a clipping that doesn't just show up in our archives, it's also in Smithsonian's Archives of American Art, on their microfilm, which we looked at for this exhibition. And what I appreciated looking at that microfilm, which for analog folks who don't know is an earlier form of visual technology, that you have to sit at a microfilm station to be able to read. Shout out to Temple Urban Archives. That one of the things that you get that's not in this image is that it's a clipping that Smithsonian has because they got it directly from John and Rashonda, and you can see that they had clipped it out of several newspapers that it ran in. So it ran in the New York Times, and then several additional Black newspapers picked up the story and also ran it in subsequent articles. And I remember sitting at that microfilm station in the basement thinking, they really clipped every version of this article when it appeared in a newspaper, which is also sort of important to think about, an artist scrapbooking their own legacy in this way, and not something that's lost on, I think, us in this moment, the importance of that work, because if that work hadn't happened, then we don't have it to rely on. John and Rashonda did not have children, and so there isn't a body of, you know, younger folks to interview about what was this history, what's your understanding of this history. And so even thinking about the fact that leaving this kind of documented record behind and assembling it was a kind of, you know, putting together the archives before there was an archive. And I think it informed some of the thinking that we were doing about how to organize the archive, to even get to a point to be able to make it, you know, findable and researchable for other researchers to write about. I also, again, appreciated how much of the travel photography helped us understand how they were moving through the world in the 1950s and the 1960s and what that looked like. So part of what you don't really get in the exhibition is the sense that all of this woodwork was made outside. There's so much photography of this time that John spent in Indonesia being supported by the Rockefeller Foundation grant that he got, where he's making all of this work in large scale wood for the first time after studying at Columbia, after being the first Black visual artist in residence at the American Academy in Rome and working in large-scale bronze, that this is the first time he gets to work in large-scale wood. And watching that shift in both the material and in the visual impulses is really interesting, but there's so much photography of the work outside that it's really interesting to think about what it does for an artist to go from working internally, in studios, in foundries, making large-scale work, to working outside. That natural environment in both the material and the setting is a different kind of shift in his work that I think is really fascinating, that I think it just would be great to think more about as you're looking at the work in the exhibition. And then this is an image of the work in John and Rashonda's home in Brooklyn Heights at 23 Cranberry Street. And part of what isn't readily obvious when you walk through the exhibition is what it means to live with all of this sculpture in a residence. And so it's not just that we're thinking about the work that an artist made and how it circulated, which is one of my favorite things to do, but also if all of that work is heavy three-dimensional sculpture and it's sitting in one place in a home in Brooklyn, how are audiences circulating through, the work? And it seemed like there were several public local audiences that we don't think of as institutional audiences for his work that included, the audience that saw this photo because it ran in a local Brooklyn press outlet because their house, which they purchased as a building, which wasn't a house, was a space that they renovated specifically for the purposes of their life and work. So it was 4 stories, approximately 8,000 square feet that they purchased in 1960, a great time to get into the New York real estate game, and used as their home and studios for the entire time that they worked. So you're looking at 2 sculptures that are on view in the exhibition upstairs, but they look very different in a living room with the piano. And so this house was on a walking tour. They hosted these amazing parties. They also taught a lot of art classes and workshops, which hopefully you'll note that those are what you're seeing images of in the slideshow upstairs in McGuire Gallery. When you're seeing John and Rajanda showing art to young kids, they're in their house in Brooklyn. They're in this house, which is where all of their art lives. And I think there's a kind of generosity and a populism to that is really worth sort of noting and appreciating as a part of his practice. And then I also wanted to sort of remind viewers that that's not the only place that this art lives. So John Rhoden's work doesn't fall out of art history, it's crucial to it. We're looking at an exhibition image from the archives from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art of the 2 Centuries of Black American Art show, where John Rhoden's sculptures are on view right at the entrance to the exhibition, which is, thinking about viewers coming into what gets celebrated as the first major exhibition of artwork by Black American artists that really puts that work in context, that David Driscoll does really an incredible job of a mammoth impossible task of trying to summarize 200 years of work in that way, that as soon as viewers enter that space, they're looking at John Rhoden's work and thinking about the history of that art with his sculptures. And that John also had a public audience for his sculptures. I also wanted to make sure that our essay did that work and laid out that context, that it's not just museum audiences, it's not just neighborhood audiences, it's almost public sculpture has unwitting and sometimes unwilling audiences. These are 2 sculptures that were commissioned for the opening of Black American museums, which I also think is an incredibly important thing to note. We're looking at Nasaika, which was commissioned for the opening of the African American Museum in Philadelphia, and Fred Shuttlesworth, which was commissioned for the opening of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And even though these are approximately 15 years apart, I think they're really a testament to the fact that there was an audience for his work such that that when both these two institutions were being founded, founders were thinking about who were the kinds of sculptors that they should be talking to commission work for the opening of their institution, and John was on their mind. And so it means that he had an audience in his time, and sort of falls out of history because we just sometimes forget to tell the stories when we're telling the stories of art history sometime. And I want to pause to talk a little bit about the contribution Dr. Sylvea Hollis made to this catalog. Sylvia had an emergency and couldn't be with us today, but we had the slides, and so I thought it would be really important to just talk about them as well and what the work does. I think the incredible contribution of that essay to the catalog is that it really does a deep dive into the history of what John Rhoden's relationship to Birmingham as a hometown and as a site meant for his artistic practice. I think that there are a lot of narratives around Southern artists in this moment where we think about art world centers and we think about the Great Migration in some really narrow ways. And I think Dr. Hollis's essay does an incredible job of not positioning Birmingham as a site Rhoden fled from to sort of fling himself into the art world and have this amazing career, but as a space that was always with him. And so one of the ways that this essay does that is by relying on all of this breadth of sources that I think is really impressive and expansive in thinking about both the materials that we get from archives, oral histories, newspaper clippings, the family histories and oral histories. Sylvea Hollis is a historian at Montgomery College and really thinks through a historian's lens about how to read archives along the grain and against the grain, how to think about ethnohistory, how to talk about family histories. She's originally from Birmingham, so she also did extensive research, even talking to her own family about the histories of Birmingham that people don't necessarily always want to discuss, but to think about that as a context for what is Black Birmingham looking like and feeling like to residents in the 1940s and 50s and 60s to understand the work that he was making. And she also worked with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute early in her career. And so I think that Kelin and I, when we were early in the processing, really benefited from her lens on that history and even identifying locations and people and images and letters and postcards that didn't have identifying information. When she visited the archives, we were like, great. I think we had a stack of Post-its and a pencil really quickly, like, please label everything that you see that we don't understand. And I think that kind of granular focus, along with an understanding of Birmingham as a kind of collective memory project in the context of, so many other texts written by people from Birmingham or written about Birmingham, both primary source material, things like memoirs and biographies, or even secondary source materials, really had an effect on the ways that she wrote about the importance of understanding that Rhoden's Birmingham was not a place that he necessarily fled from, sort of never to think about Alabama or the South again, but really every time this person who had been to New York and then Rome and then Japan and Korea and the Philippines and Indonesia and Egypt and Nairobi. Every time this person who has essentially gone on a world tour has an opportunity to engage with the arts in Birmingham, this is something that he keeps returning to and is important in some really crucial ways. And because I can't do justice to her words, I'm going to be slightly indulgent and just read from a bit of the essay to sort of give us to give color to this conversation that I think is really important. And she writes, "The city taught Rhoden that it was futile to wait for inspiration. The opportunity to live and work as an artist was a gift. Cherish it." Rhoden's memories of his hometown are an instructive space to interrogate his self-making, not only as an artist, but also as a Black man whose early childhood years were during the interwar period in the South. Rather than framing his time in Birmingham as something he was trying to flee, Rhoden, for most of his life, explained his move as merely a desire to become immersed in new places, as a means of learning through exposure. He reflected, quote, It is impossible for me to state the exact quality of the inspiration received from my travels in these countries and from seeing the varying artistic expression, whether it be the medium of painting or sculpture, or even such a thing as a basket, hand-woven. But to me, it has seemed the voice of the people throughout all time, with the past holding within itself the oncoming shadow of the future. These works that I have seen in my travels have made me realize the legacy that is upon all of us who would call himself artist." End quote. Rhoden found many mentors in Birmingham, but most of them too were sojourners just passing through. Viewing Rhoden within the history and even the land of Birmingham sheds light on his creative process and the art that produced it. It all began on a muddy hill. Reflecting on playing in clay in his early years, Rhoden shared, "Well, I have never lost that excitement. I am still excited by pure form, and shaping it is an act of love." And now I have the pleasure of kicking this over to Kate Crawford.
Either way, I can advance my slides or you can. Is this, oh, no, forward. Okay, gotcha. Thank you, Brittany. I think Sylvea's and my essays stand in such an interesting dialogue in so many ways in this catalog, and I'm so grateful to you, Brittany, for all of the work you've done on this beautiful exhibition and this collection and Rhoden's work, and also then for giving me the opportunity to write about this sort of network of Black arts promotion spaces in the South in dialogue with Sylvea's really very personal in many ways essay about Rhoden's Birmingham. It has really informed my work going forward. And I think you left us at the perfect place. Sylvea also talks a bit about Rhoden in Birmingham in the 80s and 90s, working with the Birmingham Museum of Art and the BCRI. And that's kind of where I wanted to start, because one of the things that I think about a lot when I'm looking at this catalog is the point at which we began this conversation about Rhoden's work, which was really about the gifting process that also exists around the Rhoden Collection, which we haven't talked about so much today yet. But in this beautiful catalog that Sahar and Ed and Brittany and Han collaborated to create, it's really a kind of artist book, or a book, that showcases the voices of many artists. There are these beautiful images of works that are going to be dispersed to museums across the country. And very early on, when Brittany approached me about this project, I thought, and you said, the Birmingham Museum of Art should be a key holding of this work, should be really a key node for telling this story. And I couldn't agree more. And so I thought maybe I could start there and then back a little bit into my catalog essay. The other thing I will say quickly, as Anna Marley suggested, thank you, Anna, is that if you are interested in seeing this exhibition in Birmingham, and I really hope you all are, the Association of Historians of American Art Biennial Symposium will be in Birmingham October 17th through 19th while the show is on view. Brittany has joined me on the organizing committee for that, and I think it will be a great conference. You don't have to be an American art historian to come. Please, please come and see the show. So I start with the images on this first slide. I will say Brittany and I began emailing about a possible gift of works from the John Rhoden Collection to the Birmingham Museum of Art in 2019. At that time, I had worked at the BMA for a little less than 2 years, so I'm not a Birminghamian, and I think that's really an important contrast between me and Sylvea, among others. And I had really learned very little about John Rhoden and his legacy, which I do think is important. My first-hand knowledge of Rhoden's work was as anchored in Philadelphia as it was in Birmingham, and that will be true for anyone working on Rhoden going forward, so maybe that's useful, but it's also interesting. I knew of the important work that PAFA was doing with Rhoden's archive, and I'd been stopped by Rhoden's sculpture of Fred Shuttlesworth outside of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. It's a beautiful sculpture. Was it on this? No, it wasn't on your last slide. Okay. It was a few slides ago, you saw it. And also Birmingham-based collectors Carnetta and Norm Davis had a few of Rhoden's work in their private collection, which is also pretty unusual because his work doesn't often make it to the market. After talking to Brittany, quick research in the BMA's exhibition archive really revealed our museum's deep connection to Rhoden, however, even beyond Birmingham being his hometown. The gift from the Rhoden Collection to the BMA, our featuring PAFA's exhibition this fall, and my research on Rhoden's early Southern arts communities for this exhibition catalog have all highlighted Rhoden's importance for Birmingham and for the BMA, helping us to share an expanded view of our city's creative legacy. So at the beginning of 1985, and this relates to the images you're seeing on the screen, the BMA presented a monographic exhibition of the artist's work called Sculpture by John Rhoden. And here you see two of the installation photographs of that exhibition, which was staged in the BMA's second floor, on the BMA's second floor in a space adjacent to the galleries where PAFA's show will be presented this fall. The image on the right of the screen, Rhoden's Sky Father and Earth Mother, which some of us saw in the gallery earlier today, from about 1958, stands centered on a doorway in this double height space where windows let in natural light and offer a view of Birmingham's Lynn Park. And I have to say, all day I've been thinking about this image because in this exhibition, Rhoden very deliberately includes maquettes for his public sculpture from mitochondria and Nisaika, and these windows look out directly on the park where Birmingham's the obelisk that had been built in Birmingham to honor Confederate soldiers. Birmingham is a postbellum city. This obelisk was built in the center of the city. It was taken down by our city government in 2020. Rhoden very deliberately, in shaping that checklist, chooses to have these public sculptures in his exhibition. And I think that's so interesting as a prominent Black public sculptor who ultimately would sculpt Fred Shuttlesworth for this city, the dialogue that he's setting up in shaping the checklist for this exhibition. And actually, you see that checklist at the left on Rhoden's stationery. It included 26 works made from early in his career to the 1980s, including the very recent, as of that exhibition, Priest of the Borealis, for instance, from 1980. He included works made with a wide range of materials, and as I said, maquettes for public art, which I think is important. With this exhibition, Rhoden presented works showcasing his global influences in a global civic museum that, through violent segregationist laws, excluded him from visiting except for one day each week until 1963. So as Brittany and I began our conversation, we first spoke about Rhoden's sculpture entering the BMA's collection. The timing was perfect, as the BMA's curatorial team had just completed our first collaborative museum-wide collection development plan, which included an emphasis on collecting the work of artists with deep connections to Birmingham and Alabama, as well as an emphasis on collecting art created by artists of color. Accepting a large group of Rhoden's work and becoming a key Southern repository for the study of his practice seemed especially important, as the museum did not acquire any of Rhoden's work at the time of this 1985 exhibition. In selecting works from the Rhoden Collection for the BMA, we have worked to include pieces that show the breadth of his practice, as he did in that 1985 exhibition. And it's really interesting, in that exhibition file, he shaped that checklist. It wasn't so much any of the curators. It's kind of bounced between curators at the museum, but he has very deliberate thoughts on what he wants on that checklist, including a lot of large-scale sculpture, which, again, will probably mean bringing some from PAFA for our presentation. So he really deliberately shows the breadth of his practice. And he also wants to include works that can be installed. Oh, and I also want to include, on the gift to us, works that can be installed across the BMA in each of our collecting areas, inspired by the global cultures that did influence his work. This gift includes works that you see on the screen, Agalita and Blue Eyes, Indonesian Legend. Those are both from the 60s. These were both in that 1985 exhibition. It's my hope that Rhoden would be pleased to see these sculptures join the permanent collection at the BMA, a museum he wanted to showcase the work of Black artists on their own terms and to welcome Black visitors, an ambition he shared with our then director, Douglas Hyland, in one of his last letters related to that 1985 exhibition, writing, "I sincerely hope that the show of my work is giving pleasure and drawing in segments of the Birmingham population that do not ordinarily visit the museum," end quote. Rhoden would not recognize the BMA today. He wouldn't recognize its galleries. They were renovated in the early 1990s, or its collection, which extensively features the work of Black artists across time and space, or its community, which really is broadly diverse and always growing. Featuring PAFA's exhibition later this year will provide an opportunity to again highlight Rhoden's legacy within his city and this broader collection. In my catalog essay, which is called Origin Stories, John Rhoden's Southern Art Community, I wanted to draw forward the foundations from which Rhoden benefited and launched, noting the strength of the visual arts communities that existed within his family, Birmingham's Black communities, and throughout Southern Black communities in the 1930s in particular. Although Rhoden strategically discussed these points of origin throughout his life, at times connecting to the South and at times totally distancing himself from it, as Rhoden set out to work as a sculptor, he was surrounded by growing creative networks that were being established within Black middle-class communities in the South. In this essay, I look at Rhoden as inheriting his family's artistic legacy, and it was wonderful to talk to some members of the Rhoden family earlier who really said, absolutely, we are a very artistic family, so that was interesting. In the essay, I look at Rhoden as inheriting this legacy. His grandmother drew and made quilts, and his father made what Rhoden called, quote, contraptions for machines. Rhoden didn't think of this as sculpture, but his dad was a sculptor. While he didn't call his family members sculptors, he absolutely spent his earliest years surrounded by several self-taught artists whose practices lacked archival documentation beyond his own accounts. It was not only in his home that he experienced an exhibition space, however, as fine art was also featured at his high school, Industrial High School, and I think Sylvea would have said some really important things about Industrial High School. We can talk more about that. And at the left, you actually see a photograph from the Birmingham News showcasing works displayed at Industrial High School from the 1931 Harmon Foundation exhibition, including Archibald Motley's Portrait of My Mother. And while Rhoden studied at Talladega College in Talladega, Alabama, he visited Atlanta with artist Hale Woodruff, further connecting to that broad network of support for Black Southern visual artists that was developing in this exact moment. A network he maintained into his mature career, winning a prize at the 1950 Atlanta Annual for his sculpture female figure. These weren't Rhoden's primary networks throughout his career, but they were integral to his early years. Rhoden's work was also shaped by his time in the Foundry, a space I explored his phenomenological connection to through his early years in Birmingham in my essay. At a time when few artists working in bronze spent time in the foundries as their work was being cast, Rhoden spent enough time there to, as he noted in a 1968 interview, learn Italian well enough that Italian people thought he was Italian when he was traveling in Italy. Rhoden connected with the foundry workers and brought them into his experiments, and he really does talk about them helping him shape his sculpture. Rhoden's recounting of his unusual interest in the foundry evoked for me the constant presence of Birmingham's iron and steel furnaces when Rhoden was young, as you can see as on the left of the screen in an etching representing Birmingham's downtown that was made when Rhoden was about 20 years old. And you just see on the right of that image like a little plume of smoke coming out of Sloss furnaces, but all of that heavy ink in the sky would be the smoke and smog from those furnaces that really blanketed the city. These furnaces remain a defining feature of Birmingham today, both in the fabric of the city and in the many representations of the city's early years that are featured in the BMA's collection. At Sloss Furnace, which is a defunct iron furnace designated a National Historic Landmark at the center of the city, and you see that at the upper right of the screen, the contemporary art program Sloss Metal Arts casts the work of contemporary artists that includes that of Ajahnay Williams. You see an example of that that's actually right outside of the BMA now, on the right side, the lower right of the screen. Bringing this exhibition and Rhoden's sculpture into the BMA collection will allow us to highlight these connections between past and present Birmingham, share a more comprehensive history of the city's creative development, and ensure that Rhoden's artistic legacy has a place in Birmingham's Civic Art Museum. Thank you.
Am I ready to go? Yeah. Oh yeah, I need the little clicky thingy. Hi everybody, I want to echo what all the other speakers have said in thanking Brittany initially for just mounting this magnificent moving exhibition of Rhoden's work, with which I was not familiar before being involved in this project. And I also want to thank Brittany and Lori both for organizing and involving me in the process of both this symposium and the book. I've published pieces in a fair number of books in my life, but nothing in a book so beautiful as this one. And that's in large part, I'll just add, that's in large part because of Sahar and Ed's work. And as an avid amateur photographer, it was fascinating to learn about the practicalities of making those photos and lighting those photos. That's just, I could hear you talk about that for hours. So I could talk about my process, but my process is not interesting to anybody because it involves a lot of sitting quietly at a table in front of a document box. So I won't really go into that. But what I want to do is give you all a kind of capsule overview of the things that I talk about in my essay. I'm not an expert in sculpture. I'm not an art historian. I don't really even have the vocabulary to talk about sculpture. But what I am is I'm a literary and cultural historian. And so the opportunity to work on this is just exactly one of the things I love about my job. I get asked to do something, and in the process I learn about a person, and I get to experience his artwork, and I get to meet other experts like the people up here on the stage. It's just fantastic. Okay, so even before the Cold War began, so I'm just going to launch into it, basically. You still want to read the essay because this is the longer version of the book. I'm not going to give everything away. But yeah, so even before the Cold War began, communist propaganda had long pointed to the hypocrisy of the United States rhetoric of freedom and its Jim Crow social and legal structures. And as decolonization in the global South accelerated throughout the 50s and 60s, it became equally important for the United States to establish positive relationships with these newly independent countries populated largely by Black and brown people, for whom American racism was a direct insult, not just a convenient rhetorical cudgel as it was for the Soviet Union. So in response, as the scholar Penny von Eschen puts it, United States officials pursued a self-conscious campaign against worldwide criticism of American racism. The Department of State and the United States Information Agency, who were in charge of public diplomacy and propaganda, especially wanted African American voices in these programs. So some writers who were included, like Langston Hughes and James Baldwin, they were part of the program at times, but writers are particularly problematic because by the nature of their vocation, they are eloquent and provocative, but they're also very unpredictable. Unlike Baldwin or Hughes, though, John Rhoden wasn't a famous poet, a provocative intellectual, or a high-profile novelist. Rather, Rhoden was a born sculptor, someone who really knew no other way to express himself, and more importantly, he was someone who had succeeded in the American art world. After the war, Rhoden had studied at Columbia's School of Painting and Sculpture, and following that, the awards started coming. He won a Lewis Comfort Tiffany grant in 1950, a Fulbright in 1951, and then, of course, as we've heard, in 1953, the prestigious Rome Prize, funding him to live and exhibit at the American Academy in Rome, putting him in the company of myself and Hannah, people who have gone to Rome when you were young and had it transform your lives. I couldn't agree with you more. Rhoden got comfortable overseas. He was affable, he was approachable, he was friendly. And Rashonda, who was a strikingly attractive, intelligent, and cultivated painter of Cherokee and Menominee heritage, was all of these things as well. So in 1955, the State Department asked Rhoden to be one of its traveling art specialists. It was a type of position that had been created in 1946. And then over the next 2 years, Rhoden toured a set of his works all over Europe: Iceland, Germany, Finland, Norway, Italy, and France. How do I make this? There we are. Batteries. The manifest listing the 110 pounds worth of 7 bronze, wood, and aluminum sculptures he brought on his 1955 and 1956 trips gives us a good idea of what those audiences saw on that first trip. And all those sculptures, pretty much all the sculptures I think are on display right now upstairs. In 1958 then, Rhoden was part of a State Department delegation along with State Department official Lamar Dodd and painters William Arthur Smith and Franklin Watkins. Can we advance the slide? Thank you. That was actually sent behind the Iron Curtain and that traveled extensively in the USSR, Poland, and Yugoslavia, touring museums, art schools, and individual artist studios, and meeting dozens of artists. He and Lamar Smith were even granted permission to visit the Soviet Republic of Armenia, which at that time was generally off limits to Western visitors. The United States Information Agency, whose messages rarely got back home to the US and actually were forbidden by law from propagandizing within the United States, got some bonus publicity from this trip when both the Associated Press and Ebony magazine covered Rhoden and Smith's travels. For the Soviet trip, Rhoden and the other artists didn't take along examples of their own work as he had for his earlier trip. Instead, as Kelin has written, they focused on forming relationships with artists within the Soviet Union. The Eisenhower administration stressed people-to-people diplomacy, and there were certainly a lot of people involved. We'd like to hit this slide. There were certainly a lot of people involved. Rhoden and the other two artists on the tours met local artists all day long, scheduled on the half hour. Those are all the different people you have to. After leaving the East Bloc, Rhoden spent a week in Rome before USIA sent him further east to Beirut and India, and then on to Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, and South Vietnam. He finally returned to the United States in March of 1959. The State Department was always intensely interested in local reaction to their cultural tours, but Rhoden's coverage was of particular concern for them in the 1950s, when the news of racial turmoil and violence in America spread quickly in Europe and prompted uncomfortable questions from local audiences. Accordingly, the State Department wanted Rhoden and Rashonda prominently featured in any coverage and identified as Black and Native. I think the program director had written, as they were initially considering Rhoden as a participant in the art specialist program, that he would be a good representative to send out because of the fact that he is a Negro and his wife is a full-blooded American Indian. Could you hit the slide, please? So what did Rhoden talk about on these tours? A surviving outline of his lecture suggests that it was divided into two parts. Half of it was an explanation of his technique and the discussion of the social matrix within art which was created in the United States. But artists in the Eastern Bloc and Africa were particularly curious about how an artist makes a living in the United States and how a capitalist society supports art. Here, Rhoden provided collateral benefits that the arts program could not have envisioned. He emphasized how capitalism supported the arts through commissions, through purchases of works, and even through the inspiration provided by industrial shapes and processes. Okay, we're talking about. No, we can go back.
Go back.
I mean, no, whatever, I don't care. I was referring to you.
Yes.
And if the United States Information Agency wanted a Black sculptor who would show that reports of American race prejudice were overblown, they got it. Rhoden had, perhaps more than any other Black artist besides Ralph Ellison, benefited from his connections with the foundation, university, government alliance that had emerged in the 1940s and 1950s to support culture. How racist could America be if its elite cultural institutions lined up to support a Black sculptor from Alabama? Now I can. That's the last one. But subtly, Rhoden's presence also argued to audiences that America's art world was egalitarian and colorblind. Rhoden was working in abstraction, the most advanced style of the day. European audiences likely would have expected the United States to trot out a Black artist who was working in so-called primitive styles, in folk art or in crafts. But among the three artists sent to tour the East Bloc, Rhoden was the most modern, the most abstract, sending the message that despite America's political and social problems, opportunities in high culture were indeed available to African Americans. In American society as a whole, Rhoden's presence as a cultural diplomat argued, desegregation might still be unfinished business, which was the title of a State Department exhibit that they sent at some of these cultural exhibitions in the 50s. But at the elite levels of culture, not only in art, but in the foundations and government agencies and businesses that supported artists, race had become irrelevant. Thanks.
Thank you all so much for that. I have questions for all of us and all of you, but the way we're running on time, I want to, we've been running long all day, and several of us have been chomping at the bit, so I first want to give you the opportunity to ask each other questions, because I don't think that we've had an opportunity to do that yet, and you might have seen one another's writing, but this is the first time we get a chance to have a dialogue about, what fell out of our essays, what somebody else tackled really well, what we wish we might have read while we were writing and that we might have written differently. So I'd like to start there.
If no one has anything, I'll just go with kind of the low-hanging fruit as the archivist. I'd love to hear how you as researchers engage with archives and primary source materials and how you did so in researching your essays for Rhoden.
I can start because the chronology was entirely archival material. So for me, it was really interesting just the amount of information that he kept. He kept letters and photographs and applications and report cards and postcards, passports. There was just a wealth of information, and it was almost overwhelming at the beginning, kind of like where to start, how to navigate. I was constantly worried about what I was missing. I think I put together like my draft in maybe 2 days, and Brittany was like, "How did you do this so fast?" But I did end up going back and just very carefully was just going through each and everything to sort of make sure that I was getting a fully encompassing picture of his life, because it was really important for me to produce a piece of material that could be useful for other researchers. So just having a complete timeline of his life, I was really thinking about how to use the archival materials in the most efficient way possible so that it could be really helpful for other people moving forward.
I think in answering that question, I have to give a shout out back to you, Kelin, and everybody at PAFA for having this archive digitized, because as a researcher working on this topic, having that archival material available digitally, particularly, I mean, it was later stage COVID, I think, that I was writing this, although time is a blur because of COVID. Particularly in that sort of later stage COVID moment, I still wasn't traveling much, and having that archival material available digitally was really transformative for working on this essay. And I think many of the sources that I used, primary sources, were things that I'd been investigating during COVID digitally, which was kind of an interesting transformation in my research practice as well, and really shaped the content of this essay and then the directions I wanted to move forward from out of it. The other thing I would say about that is it was amazing for me how much I was able to learn about the BMA's relationship to Rhoden through the digitized Rhoden papers, because what we have, for instance, in his 1985 exhibition file is really different from what Rhoden chose to keep. And being able to have both of those perspectives on that project really gave me a lot of food for thought moving into my essay. So reading between those two archives was really useful as well. Wait, I can keep this over here.
No, I mean, I appreciate you using the language of reading between multiple archives, because I think that I was doing a lot of that in the early stages, because, you know, I started working on this project before we had organized the archive, and it's very interesting to have to, some of my colleagues in the room might know, apply for grant funding to process an archive, where you argue for the importance of what you will find in the archive before you have actually processed it and found it. And that's a really sort of crazy making thing to need to do. And so I think in the early stages when we first started talking about this project, there were so many other institutional archives that we had relied on to think about how to get support for processing and to just wrap our minds around processing what we found, because things really were just sort of thrown into plastic bins, which meant that when I was going through archives, I was finding, you know, photos from the 1980s and then, you know, a letter from the 1950s in the same box with a sketchbook. And, you know, so nothing was labeled or organized. So even not having a context and needing to start doing this kind of writing that really sort of lays out a story was pretty daunting. And so it was useful to have that happening at the same time that, you know, the Rockefeller Foundation archives were an incredible resource that helped me think about, okay, what is the foundation view of Rhoden at this time? The archives from the Guggenheim Foundation, you know, I was sort of reaching out to every institution that had given Rhoden a grant saying, well, can I see that? Do you have the archival applications? Do you have the archival, you know, recommendation letters? Some of those recommendation letters were not actual recommendation letters. And it was interesting for me to think about what it was to see that and to know that this was information that we have as researchers that Rhoden didn't have at the time. time and sort of reading between the, what are the archives of the things that we know that existed that he kept versus the things that he didn't keep that are in other institutional archives versus the things that are in other archives that he didn't have access to that we only have access to now through particular kinds of archival processes around, the time that has to pass before you're allowed to see private data from other deceased individuals, which is another, we can talk about that during the Q&A, but even that is really interesting to think about. But it meant that sort of thinking about this work and working with you and Jana and Wang on this was really a godsend, which also sort of bleeds into what I love about your essay.
Because Brittany said we're doing okay on time, so I'm going to have to, I just have a couple very brief anecdotes, because Kelin opened the door to this about archival work. So when she said that when you open up an archive for the first time and it's not in really great shape, it can be tough to work with. And I had that experience with my last book. I was using an archive at the Lilly Library in Indiana that no one had used before. And I opened up the first box, and the earwigs came crawling out that they had eaten them. My other anecdote is I briefly worked as an intern archivist at the Ransom Center at the University of Texas, and my supervisor, I was working on one thing, my supervisor was working on the Gloria Swanson archive, the Hollywood actress, and she had sold her entire archive, which was not just papers, to the Ransom Center on the condition that they catalog and keep everything. And one of the days that I came in, my supervisor was cataloging her boxes of used Kleenex. So, no joke. But more to the point of what you asked. So my process is I have to work with the actual physical documents first. And so I came here almost 2 years ago exactly, to work up in the archives because while I do find digitized documents very valuable, and I usually take pictures of everything I do, I really need to get my hands on it first and get that. So I found being here, touching the documents, making sure that I could see everything, making sure that, because things get weirdly cataloged and placed in ways that I don't understand. But then I found myself very grateful that the collection had been digitized, because then after I wrote my essay, and of course you have to do revisions on it, and then you rethink things, and then I wanted to go back and look at these documents, and I didn't have time to come back to Philadelphia, as lovely as I like coming to Philadelphia. And it was just so convenient that they were all digitized, and I could find them, and they were well cataloged. And I was also able to get the John Rhoden materials from the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian. And I got bad news for you, Brittany. They sent it to me as a PDF. I didn't have to go down there.
That is a post-2020.
Yes, it is. So that was very useful, because I wanted to make sure that I had seen all the documents related to this, and I knew that some of it would be in the Archives of American Art. And I called them up, and they were willing to do that. So, but yes, archival work is endlessly fascinating, and you always get some good stories from it.
And thank you again for doing that work. I think every researcher that works with archives for any project comes away with it with just like an intense appreciation for the fact that, someone had to sit through this when it was completely unorganized and figure out how to organize it. And we don't think about that labor as labor, and so I'm constantly thinking about this when we see this, this beautiful catalog, which is a great finished project. But it does require a lot of, work that is tedious to a lot of people. You have to, unstick things that have old adhesives from each other. You have to put, papers and photos in folders. You have to put them in boxes on shelves and in order. It is not light work at all, and we can't do anything without it. So I would love to know from you, Kelin, and you, Han, if there are things that you came to at the end of this project, either like a really excellent object or a really great story that didn't end up in the catalog that you wish had ended up in the catalog, because I think you both have like great stories and access to incredible materials. And Han, you had that archive from the American Academy in Rome after we were already in revisions for the catalog, and so there was no way it could have ended up in the book.
Guess I'll go ahead. So this is really interesting because I did manage to get my 2 favorite stories into the book. And I don't know if you want me to go ahead with those or leave a teaser so that everyone here buys the catalog. But I will say one thing that I love about archival work in general, and then specifically about the Rhoden archives, is the just dozens of little threads that you can pull and follow down. So when we were going through the papers, there was this one photograph I saw, and it's really quite insignificant in the greater kind of body of the archive, but on the back it said the photo is by Dawood Bey. And I don't know if anyone knows him. I love him. He is a photographer. And this would have been very early, before he was probably recognized as an artist, and he was just taking artists, like photographs of art for artists, so like kind of like a day job for him. And so seeing something like that was so special, to see kind of this work of, he wasn't Dawood Bey then, he was just, the photographer kind of taking the picture. It wasn't I don't think it was like your photos, it was not that well thought out, it didn't seem like, but having these little moments where you see how everything interconnects, and then also how you can see different phases of people's lives and their careers represented, and then also how they're just serendipitously found, was something that I encountered a lot with Rhoden, and I just thought was so special and wonderful. It's kind of this journey of discovery while making this stuff available. There was also that ability to kind of see all these different people represented.
I appreciate that so much. I think the first 2 years I was working on this project, there were so many of these little discoveries that were like this, where it would be a photo of, Henry Moore visiting Rhoden's studio in Rome, or there is, not so randomly now, but there's like this great photograph taken by his brother of Lena Horne. And at some point, I remember having on my calendar like 2-hour blocks of appointments of, I'm going to go look at archival materials of this unprocessed archive so I can think about it. And every day I was like, this is like a Forrest Gump story. That's just like, every day I find like another little collection that's like, where are you and what are you doing and what's happening in this picture? Like, why are you at this party with the US ambassador to Italy? I mean, and there's this really great way that all of these things don't end up in the book or end up in the exhibition. I'm hoping that the next person who does a project on John Rhoden will take some of this up in their work. What do you think, Han?
Well, I think it's really interesting that the idea of like photographers that we enjoy has come up, because I found through many weeks of digging, Carl Van Vechten took photos of John Rhoden, and another full circle moment for me, when I was a Mellon Fellow at the PMA, one of my colleagues was working on their collection of Carl Van Vechten photos. And so I'm really familiar with the work that he was doing, and sort of the context surrounding that. So to see John as one of the subjects was really interesting and exciting for me. I had more to say, but I think I lost my train of thought. But yeah, I would say finding Carl Van Vechten was really, really interesting for me.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes out in the photos that we haven't really talked about today, but I feel like we talked about a lot behind the scenes, is that there is a way that this international narrative around John Rhoden as these incredible sort of examples for what freedom and democracy could look like in the U.S. are really fascinating as a kind of, it's almost, a kind of sort of double-edged move that the U.S. is making this particular kind of argument abroad that they weren't necessarily experiencing at home. They needed to be abroad to experience it, really. And that's something that's very interesting. But when you look at the documentary material, what also jumps out is they're exceptionally attractive people. And we don't often talk in the arts about what being charming and charismatic and visually attractive and a joy to be around can do as far as material resources for someone's career. And I do think that it's really interesting to think about that piece of it that also comes out in the archival material. I will say that, one of the things that often happened with researchers who don't necessarily include this in their in our programming or in the essays, everyone has commented, "Oh wow, he was really gorgeous," or "Oh my God, she's really beautiful." And I'm like, "Yes, she actually worked in the 1940s as a professional model." And everyone says, "Oh yes, that makes absolute sense," because there's a way that's not. That's not totally serendipitous. Even the granting officers in other institutional archives write about this. They write about how charming and good looking they are, how great they are at parties, how well spoken they are, how much you just want to be around them. You can sort of feel that a kind of institutional willingness to extend resources to them, that they you can just feel that they want to do this because they want to be around these two artists. And I think that's also an interesting context. I wonder, as somebody who's interested in context, if there's anything, Katelyn or Greg, that you appreciated about the different ways you're talking about context, because I think the global context is so important. And I was so happy to have you say yes to this project, even though I was really interested in not the art historical piece of what does it mean for an artist practice to travel around the world and connect with these other artists, because I loved the internal conversations we were having about that here at PAFA, but I thought that Cold War context was really crucial to our understanding, how does he actually have access to money to travel the world as somebody who doesn't have patrons, and what does that do for how we think about whether John might have been used by the state, or whether he might have subverted that to sort of squirrel away resources for himself that he wouldn't have had access to otherwise. And that's a really different network than the networks that you were thinking with, about how are we thinking about Birmingham, how are we thinking about the South, really how are we thinking about these other kinds of geographies that help us see John, not just as someone from Birmingham, or not just a New Yorker, not just a Brooklyn artist, but all of these other things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something I think I was kind of gesturing at as Greg and I were talking just a bit earlier. Also, I find it so interesting that John and Rashonda are never alienated from one or the other of these communities. He's able to be this Cold War cultural diplomat who you so elegantly describe, and then also bridge Black art from Carl Van Vechten to Dawood Bay. And he never leaves either of those communities. And as I was saying to Greg earlier, many of the artists with whom it seems like John had a relationship or is very close, which is not speaking to Carl Van Vechten or Dawood Bay, really we're socialists or communists, and we're training in a very different context, and we're on watch lists, and we're very actively connecting their work to their politics. And John never leaves that context, and he's never really asked to leave that, or seems to be faulted for making his living and finding his context in a very different place. And I think that's really interesting. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, Greg.
Well, doing this research and being asked to work on this, it was great because I was able to learn about something I knew nothing about. But it intersected so much with the other work that I'm doing, which is about my contention is that in the 40s and the 50s, American elite institutions, from government to military to religion, mainstream religious organizations, to foundations which are newly powerful and newly influential starting in the 40s, they kind of enter into this public-private network to support basically the liberal individualist vision of American society. And so I was working on a biography of a guy that was in the middle of this, and then here's Rhoden, who is surfing on it and taking advantage of it and using it to build his career, and I think taking as much from it as they're taking from him. And it's fascinating for me to see these kind of case studies of all these institutions coming together with a purpose, in my view, a propaganda purpose, and Rhoden able to achieve what he's trying to achieve, fulfill himself artistically and achieve success while contributing to this. And I don't know what his political opinions were. I don't know whether he was by that time, whether he was a Cold Warrior or not. I don't know. The surviving talks and the surviving notes for the talks that I found, he stays away from politics. And in his private correspondence with Rashonda, when he's traveling to communist countries, it's almost sort of banal observations about all people are sort of equal, and they're not as advanced artistically in the Soviet Union, but we're all just individual people, and it's the message that American culture was sending at the time. And I'm not arguing that he's a Cold Warrior, But we're certainly not hearing the 1930s communist rhetoric. But he's also talking in private. This is with Roshana. This is not, just in public. This is so. I found that really interesting.
I did too, and I also wondered if there was any kind of surveillance happening, and it does nothing for our conversations behind the scenes about whether or not he was a spy, which is a conversation for another day and another Freedom of Information Act request that we are waiting on response. No, because there is a way that all of this travels. The archivists and I have for years said, when are we gonna get some more information from governmental archives or official state archives that fill in this other story, because it seems possible. But another exhibition for another day. I want to be mindful of time and open up to audience questions in case there are any after all of this rich material has sort of been laid out for you.
I always seem to have questions. I don't even know which one to ask, but I want to start with just thanking you all for the work that you've done. And I wanted to make a quick point to please go on the website, the John Rhoden's archive website. You all have done an amazing job. We're talking thousands and thousands of archival documents, beautiful photographs, more than what you see in the exhibition. Please enjoy that. It's incredible. Is it weird to say that the archival works are just as exciting as John Rhoden's works in his personal life? I'm very attracted to the art that was his life, as well as the works that he's constantly creating and thinking about. And Brittany, I'd love to eventually someday see that exhibition of archival photographs and the additional essays that you would write in your head. I keep thinking about what that would look like and what that would represent. So how important was it for you to think about placing these photographical works in the exhibition, juxtapose the sculptural works?
That's a hard question. I, at one point, was thinking about a companion exhibition of just archival photographs for PAFA's Works on Paper gallery. And I want to thank our chief curator, Anna Marley, for insisting that I not do that, because I think that it was a project in my mind that I imagined could be as substantial as this exhibition in terms of square footage. I mean, I think so much of that archival photography tells a particular story about process and how the work gets made. Part of the trick, I think, of what is so compelling about all of that material, one, I'm amazed that there is so much of it. I think that what artists save, what artists leave behind for us is something we have absolutely no control over. And so the fact that all of this still exists at all, for us to try to put this story together at all, is serendipitous, except it's amazing and divine. And I feel like I have been thanking John and Rashonda in my head for the past 5 years. Every time I found something that was interesting, I was like, thank you so much for leaving this behind for us, that we could have that to tell the story with. But because there's so much visually compelling material, I could have, we could have installed all of those Carl Van Vechten photos. They're so good. Please find them on the archives website, because they're just gorgeous as photos. It was really an exercise in a restraint not to have more of them in the exhibition, because I think that there's a way that I know visually, if there's too much archival materials, then it sort of feels more like a different kind of exhibition than you want from a fine art museum. It's sort of in contrast with the sculpture, it's competing with it a bit. And I did think that, at least in this version of the exhibition, that the sculpture should sit center stage. But so all of that is to say, please look at all the photos later.
We have one more question. Time for one more question. Anybody else? All right, we got another PAFA person.
I'll just ask a question. And then Renee wants a question too. So, Brittany, I think that this is an important opportunity for you to tell people what happens next. We've talked about the show going to Birmingham. we're also partnering with a national foundation, talk about the foundation industrial complex, really, to share the show around the country, which is really exciting. But there is another aspect of this project, right? Which is the distribution of works of art by John Rhoden to museums around the country. Can you share with our audience that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's another kind of, we've gotten some stewardship questions today. So the show is traveling to Birmingham Museum of Art and will open in October 2024. And we are partnering with Art Bridges to tour a version of the exhibition to museums around the country. And that is, I think the idea behind that is partly, we're thinking about how exhibitions travel, how the knowledge travels, how can we get this work in front of as many viewing audiences as possible. Not everyone needs to come to Philadelphia to see this work, but for me, in a perfect world, everyone who goes to a museum would see this work. So the exhibition touring is a really important part of that. But we also, you're looking at about a third of the sculptures by John Rhoden that PAFA has stewardship over in this moment. So if you can imagine it, there are another 2/3 worth of the work in storage, and we are gifting that work to museums around the country. And so I've been in conversation with curators and directors from institutions across the country and the American Academy in Rome about placing sculptures in permanent collections, because that's also a way you want to see an artist's legacy stewarded. You want that work in multiple museums around the country in the same way that many of his peers have their work collected by institutions. So yes, the exhibition is touring and we are Santa Claus with the sculptures. We do mean that we are giving them away. They are by gift. So if you have relationships with other museums, please tell them to email us. Please tell them to look at the John Rhoden papers on our archives database to figure out what that fit looks like and what it looks like to work on this legacy in this way. I think Renee had a question if we had time.
I think we're out of time, but I will ask you later.
Okay.
Don't worry.
Thank you, panel. Let's everybody show our gratitude. Thank you so much. I feel compelled to say this was an incredible afternoon, and this was an incredibly wonderful talk. I loved hearing all of your perspectives. Thank you. We are going to take a half an hour break, and then at 5:30 we are going to share some refreshments to toast the launch of this incredible catalog and toast all the PAFA team that put it together. And then, of course, at 6:30, Imani Perry will be delivering her keynote address, and we're very much looking forward to that. So please stay. The museum remains open till 6:30, and the gift shop, hint, hint, stays open till 6:30. Lots and lots of catalogs. Buy some for your friends. And thank you all for being here. It's so glad you could join us, and we'll see you in an hour, right? Hour and a half.